lack of transparency and lack of understanding with some people around how to best use finance was holding back housing delivery.
Hello everyone and welcome to another episode of the Rodcast. We're very fortunate today to have our guest back on the show. He was last on episode 46. It is the CEO of Brickflow, Ian Humphreys. Welcome Ian, welcome back.
Hey Rod, thanks for having me. Yeah, good to be back.
So Ian, you've been busy not just with Brickflow recently, which is a fantastic online tool for development finance, and bridging now. But you've also been very busy recently with putting together a white paper on the housing crisis, and that's really what I want to kind of talk to you about today.
Sure.
So I guess my question to you is, why did you feel the need to put together a white paper with some other amazing people around the industry? And what does a housing crisis currently mean to you?
Okay, so I think the when we started Brickflow, one of the outcomes we wanted to achieve was to increase housing supply. So we felt that the lack of transparency and lack of understanding really with some people around how to best use finance was holding back housing delivery. And in fact, if you look at the Federation of Master Builders, who do an annual survey, going back 5 years plus, it was the number one or number two reason for developers why they weren't building more houses was lack of funding. And so our platform was part of that solution to try and address that problem. But once you get past the funding and again, this isn't just down to Brickflow, this is obviously other things going into the mix here. But now if you look at the FMB annual survey, funding is further down the list. It's number 3 or number 4 each year. So there has definitely been an improvement in access to funding, and there's many reasons for that. Digitization, there's more players in the market. There's many contributing factors to that. But I think once you solve that, you understand that actually the real problem that's called, or the big problem we have is this huge deficit we have in housing. And there was a study between National Housing Federation and the charity Crisis in 2018. And they seem to think that we're about 4.75 million homes short of what we need.
And that was 2018, wasn't it? So that's 5 years ago, and we were 4.5 million out, or 4.3.
Yeah, exactly. Yeah. And you're absolutely right. And if you look at net migration figures over that time, I mean, they probably, I would assume, exceed well over 1 million.
Yeah.
And if you assume
it was 606,000 just last year.
Exactly. And if you assume that, most of those people are couples, or, that around half of those people need houses.
Sure.
So 606,000 last year, perhaps 300,000 net new houses needed or accommodation needed. And that, as you correctly say, that's probably a similar number every year for the last 5 years. So we were nearly 5 million 5 years ago. It's probably an even bigger number now. And I think, speaking to brokers, to developers, other property investors, and people like yourself and other industry experts, there is only a certain amount of things that the private sector can do. And basically, you unravel the string and you get to the point where the planning system isn't fit for purpose. And that isn't the only problem, but it seems to be the crux of the problem. And so we took it upon ourselves, and you mentioned some of the other people that are in the paper, so like Knight Frank, PwC, Bayes Business School. So we basically brought together an ecosystem of contributors who all had a slightly different way of approaching it, or slightly different day-to-day experience of the problem, and really brought everyone together to try and understand fundamentally what are the problems. And the reason we did it was because we felt that the government weren't going to do it. So the rhetoric, we probably all remember build, build, build with Boris a few years ago. Recently, the Labour Party in their conference was saying they want to build 1.5 million homes in the first 5 years. And that's all great. And it is fantastic. Well done. Great to have like these aspirational targets. But the biggest number of houses we've delivered in the last 5 years, I think, is 240,000. So the government set itself a target of 300,000, which they've now abolished because they weren't getting close to it. They didn't want to just keep reporting failure after failure. That figure has obviously been used by Labour, 1.5 million houses in 5 years. So 300,000 seems to be the number both parties are agreeing on. But we're not even getting close to it. I mean, the average over the last 10 years is sub 200,000. So we're getting a net increase every year of the number of houses we needed. And so I guess what we thought was we'd do the government's job for them. Or we're apolitical. We don't care who solves this problem. But the point is that it needs to be solved. This is too emotive a problem, I think, for everyone, for it just to be left to fester and no one address it. And I think, we talked about it before, but I mean, we've got our 16th housing minister today.
17th.
17th, sorry, in 13 years. And that to me is just emblematic, of the disdain, lack of seriousness that's really given to the role. Like this is a huge problem for people. This policy, government policy, probably affects people more than anything else. Housing, right? Health, of course, but we don't really need it until we need it. Housing is an everyday need that every single person needs, and a democratic modern society should be able to provide its inhabitants with somewhere safe to live at an affordable price. And the fact of the matter is we can't do that, and therefore we're failing.
I think you've come up with so many great points there that I just want to come on to. So the first one being obviously the lack of net new houses, and you talked about kind of this 300,000 being the figure. We're actually on track for our worst year on record of 111,000, which is just so bad compared to, and that is the worst year on entire record. So it's just as this is coming out, we're getting even worse and worse. And then one of the other things that I thought was interesting about talking about the private sector can't do it all. And actually, if you look at who's been building houses since the Second World War, the private sector is now doing the biggest proportion of building of new homes than they've ever done before. And local authority have gone from being the biggest builder of homes to the smallest builder. And we've got like housing associations, which are pretty stable. They've grown slightly as well. So that I thought was quite interesting as well when I read those kind of stats. There's a great graph. I'll try and put a link to it in the show notes of it. But it's kind of, it's where's the emphasis here? And then it's the type of housing that's needed as well. And you just touched on that at the end with affordable. I mean, I think one of the good kind of phrases, and I can't remember where I've heard it before, but I sort of bought into it, was having a home is a right that everyone should have. Owning a home is a privilege. And I thought that was quite interesting. I can't remember, that was from a political talk somewhere years ago, but I kind of thought that was interesting. So in terms of building more, and we've heard from you again about some of the problems that's causing building to be so bad. We talked about finance, although it definitely seems like it's got better, or funding, I should probably say. planning. Should we touch on that quickly?
Yeah, so the 10 points that came out of the white paper, which we will put the link in the show notes so people can download.
Yeah.
But there were 10, and they're all interlinked. But the three key issues that came out were planning, funding, and land supply. Okay, so we've touched a bit on funding. There is something else I want to mention about funding. Whilst it's got better, I think accessibility, you could argue, well, you could look at it a couple of different ways. Planning now is the number one problem for house builders when they say that the reasons they don't deliver more stock. So you could argue that funding perhaps hasn't necessarily got better, it's just planning's got worse. But let's say perhaps that funding's got better. What's happened in the last couple of years is because we've had this huge increase in the base rate over a very short period of time, comparatively, is you've now got, instead of a credit crunch like we had in 2008, you've got this, what I term a liquidity crunch. So you've got this situation where there is still credit and people are happy to lend, and people can find borrowing. The right borrower can absolutely find funding in this market for the right scheme. There's not a problem around credit. People are being perhaps a bit more choosy. But if you think that for every 1 million borrowed by any borrower, each time the base rate goes up by 1%, that the cost of that borrowing goes up by £10,000 annually. Yeah. The average development loan in the UK is about £5 million. So that means that every developer borrowing an average size loan in the UK has now got to find an extra £50,000 in deposit to get that scheme off the ground. And if you extrapolate that further, so there's roughly around 9 billion of funding, development funding agreed every year in the UK. If you take that 5% increase across that 9 billion of funding, developers have actually got to find an additional 450 million in equity, in deposit, to borrow the same amount of money as they would have done 2 years ago. That's huge. Yeah, that's a huge knock-on effect. And so the government has a responsibility there, I feel, through that Homes England, Business Bank, etc., and other sort of quangos that they control. They need to help bridge that gap, right? That's the issue here, is that you've sort of pointed at it, that the delivery of homes this year is the lowest it's ever going to be. A lot of that is due to COVID. But then to go on to the planning point, if you look at the planning figures, the number of applications and number of approvals is dropping by double digits every single year, and has done over the last 5 years. So I think we've got a record low of planning applications, a record low planning approvals. So tie that in with the problems around funding as well, that you've got this big equity gap. The government or whichever party's in power has a huge task on their hands, just through the fact that they haven't managed this sector well at all over the last we're in third parliament now. It's just been failure after failure. So planning, yeah, go Rod.
Just on the funding side then. So cynics then might say, well, hold on, if they do that, if they do something like release a Help to Buy scheme or a new kind of similar scheme, are they just propping up house prices? And in a free market, do you not want either? You've talked about funding costs have gone up. Well, yeah, they have, unless, of course, equity starts coming down, i.e. house prices crash, and then they might not need as much. Now, you mentioned kind of base rates going from 0.25 to 5%. That is a 1,900% increase, which is absurd when you look at it like that. And that brings it kind of home when people say, oh, well, in 1989, it was 17%. Yeah, but it only was up there for 3 days. And it also only rose by about 8% to get to that point. So when you measure the two against each other, it's absolutely astronomical, the growth in a very short period of time. But I guess one of the concerns is inflating or keeping house prices high by offering cheaper finance, or there's various things that can happen. You can stretch the length of a mortgage term. 30 years ago, when first-time buyers got a mortgage, the typical term was 20 years. Now it's 40 years. So that again stretches it. So there's all sorts of things that can happen. You go over to Japan and some other areas of the world, and actually mortgage terms get passed down to the kids because they're so long. And it's these things. Yep. So do you want to go down that route? Because is it something that can then be brought back, I guess is what I'm asking.
Well, I think we're talking two slightly different solutions, right? We've got supply side and demand side. So on demand side, I don't think you need to boost demand any more than you do. Help to Buy, I think, was a good scheme.
I agree with it.
Does it need to come back? I'm agnostic. Like, I think if it came back in, it would be good for some people to help them get onto the ladder. But if it could also overheat the market. I think what I'm sort of thinking and talking about really is more on the supply side. There are people that will have land at the moment that could be built, could be delivered, but they can't deliver because they can't access the equity they need to do it. And so almost it's like a reverse of the right to buy, help to buy, where you're saying actually the government can take an equity position in the development, so they can basically bring together the land supply, people that aren't building for the reasons that they can't access the funding they need to do it, and the government can take a stake in that project.
Yeah, I think that's a great idea. And on the topic of
bring more houses to the market, we compress that demand, don't we? And that's what it's all about, is supply side, not demand side.
Absolutely. Demand. We don't, in my kind of thought process, we don't have a demand issue. And the whole idea of Help to Buy, we have Help to Buy in different guises, I guess, with 95% mortgage offers and all this sort of stuff that are, and like we've talked about, mortgage terms and things like that. But certainly on the supply side, I'm quite surprised that actually the land supply issue you just mentioned, where people can't access the funding. I'm surprised that I don't know, they're not getting letters through their door from other developers saying, "Hey, look, we've identified your land for this, and could we buy it or could we joint venture?" Because I don't know. I get enough letters through my door, and I'm not a big landowner, so
I'm sure they are, but then people, unless they actually need to build, unless they're under financial pressure to do it, they will just sit, won't they, until the market becomes easier.
Well, I think that's a really important point, isn't it? Because at the moment, it's very much I think that the government's kind of focusing on using the stick rather than the carrot to a lot of these kind of developers and landowners. Whereas if they can encourage them, now I know people might be thinking, well, Help to Buy encourage them because it inflates prices, but what about tax credits? What about all these other things that they could be doing to incentivize to get going? Because what you're really talking about is land banking, isn't it? For want of a better word. If people are sitting on land that could be developed that they're not because they don't need to, then that's just one reason why you might be land banking, but there's obviously others. But if you're encouraged to go, actually, if we can get planning through and building started, we can use this carrot to encourage you to do that. Wouldn't that be a great kind of way?
I agree entirely. I think there's two things really with this. Firstly, developers are not going to develop unless they have confidence in being able to sell their product at the price they need to sell. Right?
Yeah.
And the issue you've got at the moment, this is one of the issues that comes out of the failure of the planning system. So the planning system is, I mean, I haven't done any planning applications post-COVID, but planning applications I did pre-COVID, I pretty much got them through in the sort of 2 to 3 month window that was expected. We speak to people on a daily basis now that have the simplest of planning applications, and they're waiting more than a year.
So our last one, which was relatively simple, was 22 months.
Yes. I mean, I was speaking to a developer the other week who bought a site with outline planning 20 months ago, and all they had to do was, and it was outline plus.
Yeah.
There was very, like, the highway study had been done. There was a lot in that pack. It was being sold by the council, so the council were actually trying to get as much of it done as possible before they sold the land. And the problem you've got, Rod, is that people are buying land based on that price today and taking a view on the market, right? But they're taking a view on the market based on planning taking 6 months, right? We've now got people that are being wiped out. I'm speaking to developers that are going under as a business because the planning system is not delivering the stock in time. So there's two things. Firstly, they can't get on and deliver stock to market and therefore earn a living. But also, by the time they've got the planning, the economics of the scheme are much different, right? They've bought a piece of land based on a projected GDV, projected build costs. Okay, GDVs have now come down. Funding costs have gone up. Build costs have gone up, albeit it seems to be coming down slowly. But the point is that something you paid maybe 2-3 years ago, you paid £1 million for, is possibly worth nothing in today's market, based on a residual land valuation. So there's some big problems there, and I think there are definitely a lot of bridging lenders out there that we're speaking to who, for that reason, are getting very nervous. They're forcing people to market. So there's definitely opportunities to come, just because of the way the market's been timed, which is, there's going to be winners and losers. But I think the wider point on all of this is that the construction industry in the UK contributes somewhere between 9 and 10% of GDP. Yeah. And we're simple strategic investment in our planning system would basically boost our economy. Like construction is probably one of the biggest parts of the sector where most of the money stays in the UK. Yeah.
And do you know what?
Look at technology. Look, a lot of it goes overseas, right?
And do you know what boosts that as well? Just to boost that point, transactions on housing. So the more transactions boost more construction, even if it's existing, not or land and things like that. And obviously, whether prices go up or down is one point. But the more important point is to have transactions. So the more transactions we have, the better it is for all these other associated industries, construction being the big one. And I think that's just a massive point.
It's a real circular part of the economy, construction. It's a win-win for everyone, government, private sector. It really should be. If you look historically, any period of economic growth has generally been underpinned by construction. Get your construction part of your economy firing, and the rest will take care of itself.
Okay, so there's two issues here that I have with this. The first is, what's the solution to the planning? And then the second is, who's going to build all this? Because we don't have any people working construction. The ones we do are all going to leave the industry within the next few years because they got too old.
Yeah, and annoyed, frustrated with the lack of planning or lack of opportunities they had, right? So yeah, it's so what do we need to do? Okay, so on planning, a lack of technology is a big problem. When we're speaking to people in the sector, that's what keeps coming back, is that there needs to be an increase in funding into planning departments. It was something that was easy for councils to cut in terms of funding during COVID. I think there's still a lot of working from home. And I just don't think you have the joined up technology and environment that you might have in the private sector to keep planning ticking along as it was. I think one of the other problems that you have is there's still a huge element of subjectivity to it. We spoke to there was one instance I remember that came up in the white paper where we'd spoken to two developers that were 4 streets apart, and they'd gone for very similar schemes, but one sat in one borough, one sat in another, and one was rejected and one was approved, and yet they were, like, geographically they were a half a mile apart, but in terms of the way that they were assessed was very, very different because they fell into different boroughs. I mean, one of the other things that stats that came up during the white paper research, which astounded me as well, is that something like 20% of all planning applications that are rejected get overturned on appeal. So if you're a developer, you put something in, it gets rejected incorrectly. It shouldn't be rejected, because then the oversight committee, the people who audit it, then come and reinstate 20% of them. But that period, that process takes a year. So you've done nothing wrong, but you've got a year worth of additional time of, cost that you've got to meet for your business, not earning income purely because somebody in the planning department got out the wrong side of bed and decided your windows weren't the right windows.
And that's just on the ones that actually end up going to appeal. There's plenty that will just give up at that point and go in for a different scheme, aren't there?
You're right, yeah. And so I think funding is definitely something that needs to improve. I think if you speak to most developers, they would happily pay larger planning application fees if it meant certainty on timescales.
100%. From a developer, this is one of the biggest issues. Like, if you think about how much a planning application fee is, and then you think from the other side of the desk, the work that needs to go in from the planning officer or planning officer team, it's crazy. It's absolutely crazy. No wonder councils are going bust. And all that's happening is the workload is increasing for the people working for the council. No wonder they're going into private practice after sort of 6 months, and there's no one there to run it, because why would you want to? It's more workload and less money.
Yep. The other sort of big problem is that the Conservatives again have allowed councils to abandon their housing plans. So I think last time I checked, there's 319 boroughs in the UK, and over 60 had abandoned their local housing delivery plan because they're allowed to now. So it's a failure of leadership from the top, in that, if you don't need to provide a 5-year plan, then you're not going. You don't, right? Or if there's no process, if there's no pressure for you to do it, then you don't do it, and then that filters through, that permeates at every level, doesn't it? That lack of leadership and accountability,
or benefit, because it's a bit like these councils where, look, they're so concerned now about homelessness because they're having to put people up in temporary accommodation, and they're saying they're going to go bankrupt if they're not already.
Well, I saw a stat, and I can't remember the actual numbers, so it won't be that useful, but maybe you can look it up, Rod. But the amount of money, the millions spent every day by councils across the UK in footing the bill because we're not building enough homes is ginormous. And if that money was just diverted, or it can't be diverted, obviously, but if the same amount of money was put into the planning system, you'd be able to cure that problem like pretty quickly. And I just think it's a real failure and lack of planning, because planning for planning, and it is just a case of there's sticking plasters that are put everywhere, and you get into the point where it's all just going to explode.
Well, I kind of almost think it already has done, because these are problems. We've got 5 million individuals on the social housing waiting list. That's the waiting list.
Yeah.
5 million people. Now that's obviously not households. Households, I can't remember the number. It's maybe 1.8 or something like that. But that's on the waiting list. So these are people that need housing urgently. Like
Yeah.
that is an astronomical number. And then when
Yeah.
you've obviously got, well, we've talked about affordability of people, but it's affordability of rents too. We've got the benefits cap is frozen. So why would people want to go and rent out to tenants like that when the private sector's so much higher? So there's so many issues on that. Like again, it comes down to encouraging landowners, homeowners, landlords, all these people, encouraging them to do what you want to do. It just seems like there's no long-term thinking, and everything is so politically motivated with these 4-year terms, so that nothing gets done long term. And is there ever going to be some kind of, I don't know, cross-party work towards agreeing something here?
Well, we think one of the things that should be implemented is the housing ministerial role, or should not be a political role. It should be apolitical. There should be a body that is responsible for delivering housing in the UK, and they should not be they should be politically agnostic and not have to worry about this point scoring that each party seems to do at the moment whenever housing comes up. That to me would be a massive improvement on where we are now.
I
Um,
totally agree on that. Yeah.
and the other point that's sort of touched on just there is around land supply. That's sort of the third issue that kept coming up through the paper was I think 0.2% of land in the UK is currently designated to build on. 0.2%, which is tiny. It's an infinitesimally small amount. So 90% of land in the UK is undeveloped, but only 0.2% of it is actually available to develop on right now. So I think one of our recommendations was a national database of all available land that we think should definitely be put into place. But one thing I do believe is a really useful something that was brought up recently by the Labour Party coming into the conversation was around the green belt. So when we think about the green belt, I think as Brits, you tend to think of like rolling meadows and what is quintessentially English, or British, sorry, countryside, where you might have a picnic and swing from a rope into a river or something. That's not what the green belt is in reality. Lots of it is, yes, but 13% of land in the UK is designated as green belt. And the Labour Party picked up on this in their conference, and they talked about the term grey belt. And there are big portions of the green belt that are car parks, disused wasteland. There's a lot of land around infrastructure hubs, train stations, etc., which could be built on, and in fact is perfect for building on, because you don't have the issue we've got around London, for instance, is you've got everything's hemmed in by the green belt, and then to build you actually have to go over the green belt to areas which are less connected in terms of infrastructure, utilities, etc. So the actual cost of bringing those schemes to market is much bigger. Whereas actually, if you audited the green belt and said, well, actually, these parts of it are definitely not what was envisaged when we termed green belt, then that stuff can be delivered pretty quickly, and it's already close to infrastructure, it's already close to utilities.
Absolutely. I mean, we've got 600,000 empty homes in the UK. And a lot of that is about actually, they're just in the wrong places, which is why no one wants to live there. They're in either lower value areas, so people don't want to retrofit them up to what they need to be lived in, or they're in places that there's just not enough demand. And we've got even more empty commercial spaces as well. And again, infrastructure is a massive thing, but the government's shown recently they're not very good at sorting that out. I mean, HS2 is kind of just, honestly, if you can't laugh, you'll cry. Like these things that go on, you just think, what is going on here? This, like, yeah.
Well, I think Michael Gove said recently that building on brownfield land, brownfield sites, was a real key part of them delivering housing to market quicker. And I do think the repurposing of industrial areas, of retail areas, certainly from any high street I've walked along recently, it seems to me quite obvious that we don't need anything like the amount of retail space that we used to.
Yeah.
And repurposing that to meet our residential needs would seem to be a quick win. And I think that's really what we need to focus on, is that certainly policy across the board needs to be really ripped up and rethought about, but certainly delivering quick wins as part of the process is really needed, because as we've already touched on, councils are paying tens of millions, if not hundreds of millions per week, per month, housing people that don't have a property to live in. And we shouldn't be putting these people up in hotels. We should be providing them with housing that they can live in. That is a much bigger win, right?
Of course it is.
Yeah.
Is there anything about kind of, if we look at other kind of G10 countries and what their housing supply is like? I mean, housing is a big issue pretty much everywhere in the world, but we seem really poor at it. We've also got a lot of very old housing, which is the other thing. So net housing is an important one, not just new starts, because we do tend to knock old buildings down every now and again as well. And it's hard to retrofit old Victorian 100-year-old homes. So that's the other thing.
Yeah, I think there are definitely cultural issues. Like, I think as a culture, what's the old saying? An Englishman's castle, home is his castle, or something. I do think there is a requirement, a desire for bricks, rather than. And it's interesting you mention this, because one of the recommendations in a white paper was around the adoption of MMC, modern methods of construction. So if you look at places like France, I think Sweden, 45% of their housing is MMC.
Yeah.
If you look at our delivery in the UK is about 8% annually. Japan, it's close to 20% each year is MMC. France higher than us, Germany's higher than us. I think, aside from the constraints we have around the size we are as a country, we're quite densely populated compared to others. They definitely have more land to bit and more space to use. But I think one of the things that we focused on in the report was that MMC, again, this is a leadership point. The government, if they could get the local authorities and housing associations to adopt MMC, that would help us to adopt it uniformly or on a more wholesale basis. So the part of the problem around MMCs, one, it's sort of, again, culturally, historically, is perhaps not seen as desirable, but also one of the issues you've got is that around mortgages. So the end buyers, the developer needs to know that the end buyers can get mortgages to mortgage these homes. And certainly there hasn't been enough support or pressure from government to get banks to underwrite the loans to support these houses, right? If we get anything close to delivering the number of houses we need, MMC definitely is part of the solution. But if banks aren't going to fund it, then developers aren't going to build it. So if we can get the government to build the things that don't need mortgages, housing association and local authority housing, if we can get them to build with MMC, then that definitely creates a bit of a change in the view to them.
So with I mean, I've done some modular builds before, and I think that they're absolutely fantastic. If I could build everything using modular build, for example, which is a modern method of construction, I would. But what's stopping me is not mortgages. I actually found mortgages with the firms that I used were great. As long, firstly, you look at right the end mortgage. Is it going to be on? Is this construction method and the factory on the Council of Mortgage Lenders list? Does it tick all those boxes? Yes, great. There was plenty of mortgages available to buyers afterwards. Then you've got development finance. Now that's a bit trickier. How do you go and kind of the monitoring?
They'll be led by the availability of mortgages. So
and
that you're absolutely right. It's
investing.
the way to approach it. Is if
Yeah.
you can find mortgages, then you'll get development funding.
But well, we could get development finance, and that wasn't the issue either. The issue is cost. It costs more. And it is faster, so you do save some costs there. But on the whole, it's hard to justify the cost. Now, what could save money is if you get that factory in at the design planning stage, so they can start to give you more off-the-shelf kind of designs to put into the planning. That can help as well. I absolutely agree. I think if councils and housing associations are using more of it, it will work. But I just wonder why you're getting kind of, was it Lloyd's who bought a factory recently and have just kind of closed it down?
I think LNG have done the same.
LNG, yeah, it might have been, yeah. So, I mean, I agree. It's a great, I think it's fantastic, and I think we should be doing more of it. I mean, quality control is much better, speed is much better. There's the only downside.
You don't need as much specialist
absolutely
construction skills.
Yeah. It's just slightly too expensive. For the last couple of projects, we've really wanted to do it, and we just haven't been able to make it work viably in terms of the cost.
But again, I think if you've got wider adoption, then that cost starts coming down, doesn't it?
Yeah, you'd hope so. So I think your idea around councils and local authorities and housing associations, kind of, or government in general, doing that is brilliant. And I'd like to see that happen, because we're getting back onto that construction and labour point. Who is going to be delivering all these builds if we manage to sort out funding, if we manage to sort out planning, if we manage to sort out the land supply issue? Who can do it? Because people aren't flooding into the trades and apprenticeships at the moment, are they? Where's the benefit for them here? And what can we do to fix that?
I mean, I think again, it's a demand and supply point, isn't it? But a lot of the specialist construction knowledge and trades, there was a bit of an exodus after Brexit. The government have tried to address some of these points by creating exemptions on visas, so promoting, making it easier for people with these skills to get visas and work in the UK. So I think if you have the supply there, if you have the ability to deliver the housing, I think getting the skills will be less of a problem, because there are ways in which the government can incentivize people coming into the UK to do it. And I do think also as well, and I think this is probably a wider social point around our societies going forward, is that we do need to have or rebase what is most important to our economy. We need to be more balanced. We can't all be computer programmers.
Sports scientists.
Need some of these. Yeah, we're still going to need some of these skills that perhaps aren't cherished or celebrated as much as they should be. I mean, engineering in the UK is crazy, really. The number of people that choose engineering in the UK, I think, is the lowest in Europe. Whereas, that's a very noble profession or industry to pursue. We just don't. We have our what.
Well,
what
we've
we think is needed is
well,
different to
we've
what's
we've
actually
we've
needed.
got more yoga teachers than we have people that do yoga classes. So that's probably
Really, that's really interesting. Yeah, I think, but I did see something around personal trainers. I think you've got similar kind of glut of personal trainers.
it seems like there's obviously, like you put in, you've got these 10 points that you put in the white paper. There are the main ones, which seem to be funding, planning, land supply, and then what was the other one?
I think technology is
Yeah.
probably a big thing. That underpins a lot of it is the adoption of technology across the sector.
Mm.
There's competing interests, and there are competing bodies, and I think really some pretty brutal cost benefit analysis needs to be looked at across all of it to ensure that we are delivering for both society but also boosting the economy, and that to me is the crux of it. If you can tell if you can say at a policy level we've got something that improves the lot of our voters of society as a whole, and it improves our economy at the same time, that really should be all that we need to know.
Absolutely, but the problem is not in coming up with um, a lot of the ideas. The problem is in getting it done. I mean, look at the NHS's computer system that they spent 2 billion on and never used. I mean, it's these sort of things that you think, how incompetent are these kind of services and government bodies, and that's why I think the most important thing that you've kind of said in terms of solutions is to have a non-political group that is housing. Bit like I don't know, central bank, although that's probably a poor example at the moment with how they've been performing. But I think the idea around that is really really important, to have something that is non-political behind housing, that everyone gets on board with, and they have a long-term kind of outlook. It's a bit like, I mean, we talked about 17 housing ministers. If you've got a football team and you change the manager every 2 minutes, I mean, the chances of them doing well are small. You've got to have some good leadership.
It's the Chelsea of the government. No, you're absolutely right. I mean, I think that the irony of it is, if you said to the Conservatives in 2010, I'm sure that you're going to be in power for 14 years, it will be by next year, right? I'm sure they would have approached things very differently with housing. And that's the point we're trying to make, I think, isn't it? Is that if you had like an apolitical appointment that didn't have to worry about winning votes, they would do what's best for the economy as a whole and for all of our stakeholders, and that's members of UK PLC, isn't it?
Absolutely fascinating. So, Ian, thank you so much for coming on the show today. We will make sure we've
Thank you,
got a
Rod.
link to that white paper so everyone can go and check it out. There's some absolutely brilliant stuff on it. And hopefully we'll be able to catch up soon. Hopefully the government take it all on board and
Well,
release it
it'd be the
soon.
first thing that's been, whoever the new housing minister is, I think it's probably been announced as we're recording. It will be the first thing in their inbox. Congratulations on your new appointment, and here's a blueprint how you do your job.
Well, you're making it easy for them.
Exactly, mate.
Brilliant. Thanks a lot, Ian.
Cheers, Rod.
Good to speak to you.
Take care.
Cheers.